program funded by the Dutch National Science Foundation, known as NWO. Before I say anything more about the conference, I give the floor to the Dean of the Erasmus School of Philosophy, Huub Swart, who will address you with a word of welcome.
Thank you very much, Fred. A big honor for me to say a few words of welcome indeed. To all of you, but especially of course to those guests who traveled far to get here in time. So very welcome. This is Erasmus University. We're very proud that we carry this name, Erasmus, around. Erasmus was a philosopher. Not many universities in the world are named after a philosopher. Maybe his field of expertise was not very theoretical, it was more on the practical side, ethics, things like that, but nonetheless, we're happy to carry this name into the present and the future. Actually, this is a relatively young university, something like a century old, mid-sized, I would say 30,000 students, 3,000 employees, of which our staff is 1% actually. So small faculty, but they are very, very active. Actually, this university consists of two campuses. One is the medical faculty, which is very huge and big. And on this campus, we used to be known especially for economics and management, a little bit social science, but here philosophers are very, very active as well. So, nice place to be. I'm very honored to welcome you also because I do think that this final conference is the final event of a very important project. For those of you who are very well informed about the Dutch system, yes, NWO is a very important organization, Fred already mentioned it. And I found a lot of research, especially via the so-called Veni-Vidi-Vici trajectory. And this final event is the final event of a Vici or Viti project, structural reality structure, and which is very special also because, and I think we deserve to be mentioned like that. Fred is one of those colleagues who managed to acquire all three grants, and that's why we call him in Dutch academia a Caesar, because he acquired a Veni, a Vici, and a Veni. So I know you hate military language, but nonetheless, this is a very strong point. And with this very short welcome, I give the floor back to you, because I think the moderator of this event as well.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. Also on behalf of the program. Yes, I'm going to say a few words by way of introduction. There was a little text on the conference document, so I assume you all have read that. I'm not going to read it out loud, so I restrict myself to only a few comments. You have signed a form because you will be registered by Mike Wright from the archive. He's registering everything, and as soon as possible we hope to put all the registration, so the things on a YouTube channel, which is also called The Structure of Reality and the Reality of Structure, and so then also other people in the world can watch all your marvelous talks. A second point, there will be a conference volume, and in discussing this with the Springer Verlag, they said, well, you need to do something that makes it more than just another conference volume. So we decided to do this like the old series Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science, where you have question and answers being recorded after the talk. So we shall do that too. And we have a round table at the end of the conference that will be recorded too. It will be transcribed, and that will also be part of the edited volume, in the hope that it will have some added value then. Rather than you all thinking with your marvelous ideas, I'm going to publish them in an A journal, not in some second-rate conference volume it's on its way to oblivion as soon as it's published. You are all going to make sure that it is not going just another conference volume on its way to oblivion as soon as it is published. Okay. Tomorrow at the end of the day there are conference drinks, yes, and you can order anything what you like. And this is in sharp contrast to our usual colloquia where the choice is extremely restricted. So if you want to get drunk, that's your opportunity. Yeah, we had some trouble with the coffee and tea department here. It is here as the same, I guess, in every other university due to neoliberalization and stuff. They make it almost too expensive to afford. So what we did is, at least we had these, we bought them ourselves. This is Rotterdam tap water. So you can take a bottle and you can fill it with Rotterdam tap water when the bottle is empty. The tap water in the Netherlands is of extreme high quality. There's no chloride in it like they do in southern nations where you can't drink it. Here you can drink the tap water. And so you take a bottle and fill it for yourself as soon as you are thirsty. Okay. Welcome, guys. Thomas. Yes, I'm going to announce now the first speaker here. The first speaker is David Chalmers. Oh, look, by the way, our patron saint, Aristotle, here he is. He looks upon everything we do. Okay. David Chalmers, the conscious mind. You might wonder what is a philosopher of mind doing here, right? But if you say that, you have been out of touch, of course. Because some time ago he published an edited volume, Metaphysics, a quite influential volume. So he forayed into metaphysics, and now he is also entering the realm of philosophy of language and epistemology with constructing the world. But even that was not sufficient to invite him here. You might wonder what's David Chalmers doing here, you know, just because he's a famous name. No, not like that. But he published a paper in the Journal of Philosophy called Structuralism and Scepticism. And then we thought, yes, now he is qualified. So please, David.
Okay, thank you, Fred, for putting on this wonderful conference and for lowering your standards far enough to allow me to come. It's really a wonderful topic for a conference. By the way, I'm very sorry I could only stay for the first day of this conference. I find it really irritating normally when speakers just drop in for a day and take off. Unfortunately, my only excuse is that long ago I accepted an invitation to a conference that starts tomorrow. So when Fred invited me for this one, I said, oh, sorry, I can't. I can only come for a day. And he said, please come for a day. So anyway, I'm really sorry I can't stay around to hear the rest of the talk. It's a great topic, and it's one that I'm really very interested in. I've been interested in, structure and structuralism actually for a fairly long time. This book, Constructing the World, was in many ways inspired by Carnap's Aufbau, the logical structure of the world, which of course is one of the great structuralist works of philosophy. And in that book I was partly trying to see if I could carry off at least a relative of Carnap's structural construction project under somewhat different constraints. And over the last decade or so I find these structuralist ideas popping up through in many, many different corners of the way I think about philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, philosophy of science. But today the theme is epistemological, and I'm actually going to be talking more or less about this is going to follow very much the paper in the Journal of Philosophy that Fred talked about. Apologies if that's repetition to any of you. But the basic project is to talk in the anti-skeptical genre, to argue that if a certain form of structuralism is true, a certain kind of argument for a strong form of external world skepticism fails. In particular, certain what I'll call Cartesian arguments for global external world skepticism fail. The ambition is very limited. I can't stress this enough. This is in no way a refutation of skepticism in general, in no way a proof that we have knowledge of the external world. I'm rather skeptical that such things are possible. It's just refuting a certain very strong form, certain kind of argument for a very strong form of external world skepticism, nonetheless a very well-known and influential kind. I won't argue all that much for the antecedent of the conditional, that structuralism about the physical is true, although towards the end I'll at least address some objections and talk about some motivation, and I won't argue against other forms of skepticism. Now, since this is a conference which is mostly about structure and reality, and where people here are mostly, I take it, philosophers of science who've thought a lot about structuralism in the context of scientific theories and structural realism in particular, I thought at least I'd start by locating the kind of structuralism I'm interested in against that background. I mean, I think of structuralism in general across, say, philosophy of, not just philosophy of science, but philosophy of mathematics, metaphysics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, roughly comes to the view that all claims or truth about some domain are equivalent in some sense to structural claims or truths in some sense to be spelled out, and you can talk about how that manifests itself in many different domains. But in the philosophy of science, typically taken as a claim about scientific theories, then the thought about you get different versions of, say, structural realism in the philosophy of science from different ways of thinking about the thesis that all claims about various theoretical domains in the vocabulary of these theories are equivalent to structural claims in some sense of structural claims, and then we can limit it to knowable claims or what's actually true. And so on, we get various familiar theses like epistemic and ontic structural realism by qualifying this in various ways. The central form of structuralism that I'm interested in here today is not exactly epistemic structural realism, and it's not ontic structural realism. It's what I'll call conceptual structural realism. And I'll start with a statement of conceptual structural realism about physical theories. This is basically a claim about the content of theories. So the content of physical theories can be expressed using only structural expressions plus observational expressions. What's structural expression? I guess this is one of our core topics for the conference, exactly what counts as structure. I mean, the structural realism, the route into structuralism that I like comes through the work of Carnap, and of course for Carnap, structure was, he talked about the logical structure of the world, and the central structural expressions were basically logical, or maybe logical and mathematical, but Carnap himself soon realized this wasn't going to work. This was going to lead you into Newman's problem of vacuity, so even in the Aufbau, he appeals to further notions like something like a notion of naturalness or foundedness of properties, which he recognizes indeed as a constraint to make your scientific theories non-vacuous. I take it since then, people working in the broadly structuralist genre allow themselves a somewhat broader range of structural expressions to state the structural content of various theories, and I think in particular allowing in notions like the notion of a law or of natural or gnomic necessity is a pretty legitimate structural notion here. You can make the case for causation, you can make the case for fundamentality, you can make the case for parenthood. Those are all going to be structural expressions as I count them, but not on the other hand substantive notions like space and time and mass and charge and so on. I mean, there's a really interesting question, of course, about what counts as structure, which is only going to be answerable given certain kinds of purpose. Carnap's purposes are all tied to scientific objectivity and being able to cast your theories in a way that allows for a certain kind of intersubjective, communicable theories of the world that doesn't rest on having had certain specific experience in certain domains. I think you could at least make the case that these expressions serve that purpose. On the other hand, that's not my purpose today. My purpose today is broadly epistemological and thinking about skepticism. I think these notions can also play the relevant role there. So conceptual structure, I like to think of this as a very basic form of structural realism. It was something like this that kind of advocated in the Aufbau. Something like this you get from the work, say, of Lewis on theoretical terms. How does it relate to epistemic and ontic structural realism? I take it that it entails epistemic structural realism before the content is structural or the knowable content is structural, not vice versa. It could be that all the knowable content is structural, but not all the content is structural because, for example, there's some non-structural content to our theories, which is not itself knowable. Nonetheless, the two do fit naturally together. It's consistent with both with ontic structural realism and with its denial. Conceptual structural realism is certainly consistent with the claim there are non-structural aspects in reality, such including things like underlying quiddities that underlie the structure that the scientific theories don't talk about. By the way, I use structuralism rather than structural realism in this context for a couple of reasons. But number one, it just seems kind of, if I wrote a paper called Structural Realism as a response to skepticism, it would seem somehow question-begging, right? So if you're a realist, then you've already made assumptions that typically realism, especially realism of epistemological varieties, is understood as inconsistent with skepticism, depending how it's defined. At the very least, it would sound question-begging. I think conceptual structural realism, as stated, is only it's a claim about the content of theories, doesn't make any assumptions about their truth, and therefore doesn't have too much in the way of any strong form of realism built in. So the rough idea of the structuralist response to Cartesian skepticism, as I think of it, is that think about classic Cartesian scenarios like the brain in the vat scenario or the matrix scenario or the evil demon scenario. The thought is that take the structural observational content of physical theories. That structural observational content is true even in those Cartesian scenarios used to support global skepticism. Why? Roughly because, say, the brain in the vat scenario, or the matrix scenario, or the evil demon scenario share relevant structure with the real world as we think of it. So even if we can't rule out these scenarios, this doesn't undermine our physical theories or our beliefs about the physical world more generally. That's the rough idea. The paper is going to elaborate that rough idea and to spell out both the premises and answers and objections. So okay, so I'll start then with a classical Cartesian argument for skepticism. Premise one, I can't know that the evil demon hypothesis is false. Premise two, if I can't know that the evil demon hypothesis is false, I can't know that I have hands. Conclusion, I can't know that I have hands. Now, the proposition here that I have hands was pretty much arbitrary. I could have put in any positive empirical proposition about the external world. So generalizing, we can't know any empirical proposition or any positive empirical proposition about the external world. So I'm going to call a Cartesian hypothesis, or a global skeptical hypothesis, a hypothesis like this, like the evil demon hypothesis, whose possible truth seems to threaten knowledge of arbitrary empirical claims all at once. Roughly, if you're in this scenario, then the possibility of this scenario seems to threaten arbitrary empirical knowledge. This is distinct from, say, a local skeptical scenario. Maybe you can consider beliefs one at a time. My belief that that's a zebra in front of me, and then the painted mule hypothesis might threaten that belief without threatening a million other beliefs that I have. That's a local skeptical hypothesis leads to local skepticism. Put enough local skeptical hypotheses together, and you might get some weak form of global skepticism where each of your beliefs is threatened individually by discrete skeptical scenarios. But I take a global skeptical hypothesis to be one whose possible truth threatens knowledge of arbitrary positive empirical claims all at once. There's a few niceties in getting that articulated carefully, but this is good enough for our purposes. The epistemic possibility of Cartesian hypotheses like these seems to lead to global skepticism, on which we can't rule out that all or almost all of our positive empirical external world beliefs are false. That's a particularly radical form of skepticism, the kind I'm concerned with today. And as I mentioned, local skepticism may in fact suffice for many skeptical purposes. Maybe even if you want to argue that we don't know anything, all you need to do is to come up with a skeptical hypothesis for each of our beliefs, one at a time. So my argument here is not even going to vindicate the claim that we know anything, so be it. It's global skepticism, which is this strong form that's my target today. So, faced with this kind of argument from 1 and 2 to 3, the most familiar responses deny premise 1 and try to make the case somehow that we can know that the evil demon hypothesis is false, or that the eternal dream hypothesis is false, or the simulation hypothesis is false, and so on. There's Descartes' theist route to that. I have these perfect ideas, there's a God wouldn't deceive me. There's dogmatist roots, somehow I know, perhaps by perception, by common sense, that I have hands that entails that the evil demon hypothesis is false. There are abductive roots. Inference is the best explanation. The evil demon hypothesis is a bad explanation. There are incoherentist roots. Somehow the evil demon hypothesis is incoherent. We ruled out a priori. I'm going to focus, though, on the strategy that denies premise 2. That if I can't know the evil demon hypothesis is false, I can't know I have hands. There's a couple of different ways to deny premise 2, but the strategy that I'm going to follow is one I call veridicalism. Veridicalism says that subjects in these classical Cartesian scenarios have mainly true beliefs. So if I'm in an evil demon scenario, or a simulation scenario, or a brain in the vat scenario, I still have hands, and so on. If that's right, then my inability to rule out Cartesian scenarios doesn't undermine most of my beliefs. So you can find different strands of veridicalism here and there in philosophy coming from different avenues. One very natural route to veridicalism, one might think, would be through idealism and phenomenalism, where, after all, the subject in a brain in the vat scenario has more or less the same experiences as a subject in what we think of as an ordinary scenario. So if experiences or appearances constitute reality, they'll be in the same reality. I don't know. I've asked Berkeley scholars if you can find this in Berkeley, and apparently it's not easy to find a view directly like this in Berkeley. Berkeley doesn't really engage all that much with Cartesian skepticism. At the same time, Berkeley does have a view where God plays a role not entirely distinct from the role played by the evil demon in a Cartesian scenario. It's not entirely unreminiscent of that, and Berkeley certainly goes to some length to make the case that's not, in fact, a skeptical scenario, and that's one where the real world exists. So maybe you can find a flavor of veridicalism there. I think of the locus classicus of veridicalism as being in O.K. Busma's paper on the evil genius, published in the Philosophical Review in the late 1940s. If you haven't read Busma's paper, you should read it. It's wonderful. It's got a couple of fables about an evil demon who sets about trying to deceive this guy called Tom, and Tom isn't having any of it. You got some bibliographical notes about Busma?
Well, can I ask a question? Is
No.
questions okay?
Absolutely not. So what are the rules?
Please.
Well, the obvious person has come.
What's that?
The obvious person has come.
Okay, we'll go on.
Kant is a sort of Berkeleyan who takes the appearances seriously. And political, the phenomenal world is, and all of our experience of it, is entirely correct and veridical.
The gentleman in the delightful spotted shirt says that the obvious person is Kant because Kant takes the appearances to
Be veridical.
and
indeed does, of course, have an argument against scepticism about the external world as a
but
consequence.
what is his line? Okay, forgive me, I can't remember Kant's line on the evil demon scenario, but what is the
Well, he doesn't actually mention the evil demon,
okay.
but
So radicalism, as I think about it, is specifically a line about these standard Cartesian scenarios. That's why I'm having trouble seeing
okay,
how
all right.
Kant
So
fits in.
Q&A, we'll come back.
Okay, very good. That's my question to be done. So, Gaussman, the locus classicus of verificationism, talks about, he basically has a couple of fables about how an evil demon goes about trying to fool someone, and first he tries to fool this guy, Tom, with papier-mâché illusions, but not terribly convincing, and Tom quickly figures out his face is made of paper. It was a discoverable illusion. So, you didn't fool me. Hopeless attempt at deception. And then the second time around, the demon goes whole hog and makes the illusion totally undiscoverable. And then Tom says, this is an illusion, because if you can't discover it, it's not an illusion. So, so this doesn't count. No, this is just, these really are flowers, and so on. Don't tell me it's an illusory flower if I can't discover that it's a flower. So basically, Tom and Busma turn out to be some kinds of verificationists. So that's the verificationist route to veridicalism. Basically, to count as an illusion, it's got to be a discoverable illusion. To count as not being a flower, it's got to be verifiable. It's not a flower. So anyway, there's a lot of routes to veridicalism. You get that through idealism, through verificationism. Perhaps more well known in recent years, Davidson gets there through a certain kind of coherentism, and most well known of all, Putnam gets there through a kind of externalism. At least there's one paragraph in Reason and Truth in History where Putnam talks about the brain in the vat, who's getting experience as of trees, and whose use of the word tree, or maybe the mental representation of trees, is causally regulated by some bits and pieces in the vat. Says if certain crude causal theories of reference are true, then the word tree for the brain in the vat might refer to that stuff in the vat, and its belief that there's a tree in front of it might, if all goes well, come out true. So that's a form of veridicalism too, and toward the end maybe I'll talk a bit about the relationship between the structuralist form of veridicalism that I like and that externalist form. But anyway, the route that I'm taking to veridicalism is none of those. It's an argument from structuralism. So I already said about what I take to be structuralism in general, and somewhat more specifically, conceptual structuralism about physical theories. Conceptual structuralism about physical theories, way back at the top, the content of physical theories can be expressed using only structural expressions plus observational expressions. Now it turns out that for this argument to work, I need something a little bit stronger than that. It's not just a claim about physical theories, because I want this to apply to claims made in ordinary physical language about the external world. If not, I probably don't need to get as far as like there's a desk there, but at least there's an object here of a certain shape and size. Claims made in what we might call ordinary macrophysical vocabulary about the existence of objects with spatiotemporal properties and mass and so on. If you can make the case that those are true in skeptical scenarios, I think you've already made the case those are not globally skeptical scenarios. To make the case if we're in the evil demon situation, there's actually an object here of such and such shape, such and such size, such and such mass. You've already more or less defeated the skeptical line on that. So I'll stick to claims in physical vocabulary, and I'll say all physical claims are conceptually equivalent to claims using only a structural and phenomenal vocabulary. This involves two mild extensions of this conceptual structural realism. It extends it from physical theories to ordinary non-theoretical physical claims. Mind you, only those about space, time, mass, and so on. If you assume that the concept of space, time, and mass used in our ordinary physical claims have exactly the same content as those notions used in our theories, then this is really no extension at all, but I just flagged that as being a place where somebody might see a gap and want to push. The other extension is to move from observational language to phenomenal language. I mean, there's quite a long history of treating the phenomenal as the most basic observational language. Certainly that's present in Carnap and others. You might think that's also an extension. Observational language might involve saying that there's something red here. Phenomenal language says I'm having an experience of something red here. On the other hand, there's a very long tradition of cashing out predicates like red in terms of causes experience as a red and trying to reduce them to something phenomenal. Again, something like that move is involved here too. Again, this gives rise to a potential gap, especially I think when it comes to observational notions of space and time, but I'll come back to that toward the end. Okay, but with that conceptual structuralism on the table as a premise, we can then articulate a structuralist argument for veridicalism. So I'll start by focusing on what I call full-scale Cartesian scenarios. A full-scale Cartesian scenario is one that involves some kind of complete model of a corresponding non-Cartesian scenario. So take, the world as we ordinarily think of it, and think of an evil demon counterpart of that as an evil demon who has, any evil demon, presumably, to do the evil demon's work, is going to have some kind of model of the world in its head or whatever to serve as the basis for the simulations. I leave the room, I come back in, I get a tram around Rotterdam. The evil demon's going to have some kind of model of Rotterdam and the people I'm seeing here I've seen before, and so on to make this work. A full-scale Cartesian scenario involves something like a full-scale model of a universe. So I'll start with these full-scale models and then strip them down. So think of a matrix-style simulation of the whole universe, or a whole universe-scale dream, and so on. Okay, premise one: all physical claims P are equivalent to structural claims S of P. That's just structuralism about the physical. Premise two: for all positive physical claims P, if S of P is true in a non-Cartesian scenario, S of P is also true in a corresponding full-scale Cartesian scenario, one which involves a kind of full-scale simulation of the original scenario. Put those two together. For all positive physical claims P, if P is true in a non-Cartesian scenario, is true in a corresponding full-scale Cartesian scenario. So that's veridicalism, or at least veridicalism about full-scale Cartesian scenarios. I mean, actually, to get veridicalism, you'd also need the premise that P is true in ordinary non-Cartesian scenarios, then, which most people usually take to be the case. Assuming that ordinary non-Cartesian scenarios don't pose a threat to the truth of our beliefs, then corresponding full-scale Cartesian scenarios don't either. So that's veridicalism, at least for these full-scale scenarios. And there are some tricky bits and pieces here about how to understand these scenarios. This is all, I'm thinking about these scenarios always epistemologically, not as counterfactual possible worlds, but as broadly epistemic possibilities for how our world might be, hypotheses, if you like, about how our world might turn out. So I'm thinking of them as broadly epistemic rather than metaphysical possibilities. And as everyone knows, Kripke and so on, thinking about these things as hypotheses about how the world turned out. It's epistemic possibility that water turns out to be XYZ, even if it's not a metaphysical possibility that water is XYZ. Here I'm doing all this in this same kind of epistemological mode. So even if it turns out that we're in a non-matrix scenario and somehow essentially, certain kinds of physical goings-on might be essentially non-matrix constituted. It's still at least an epistemic possibility that they are, and here I'm thinking about scenarios epistemically. Okay, so premise 1 was the premise I said I wasn't going to argue for very much, although I'll come back to it. For now then, the key premise is premise 2. Okay, the case for premise 2 goes by what we might think of as structuralism about simulation, which says that full-scale simulations and full-scale models replicate the causal structure of a simulated system. So say you've got two fundamental particles that stand in some causal relation in a non-Cartesian scenario, then there will be corresponding virtual objects that stand in corresponding causal relations in a simulation scenario. So you've got a model. Say it's a computer, it's a matrix case, then where one ball hit another, you have a data structure for one ball and a data structure for the other ball, and as the properties of one change, those affect the one data structure change, those will affect the corresponding properties of the other data structure, and one will have isomorphic causal claims between the two. I mean, some of this falls out of a structuralism about computation more generally, that, and I've argued for in a lot of other work, about what it is for a given computation to be realized, is a matter of there being a physical system with a causal structure that mirrors the formal structure of the computation. Here I'm not going to go to that technical level, but I'll just stay with this intuitive idea that in a full-scale simulation of the model, there's always going to be this underlying causal isomorphism. Most obvious for the matrix case, but you think about the evil demon case. The evil demon is really maintaining a full-scale model of the world and wants to model what happens when one ball hits another ball, the bat hits the ball. It's going to have a certain model of the bat and a model of the ball, and the ball flies off and hits another ball, and different parts of the model are going to have to interact with each other. And so on. Same even for a dream. Think about what's going on in the dream. You got bits of a mind modeling bits of the world, and you're going to get interactions between the bits of the mind that reflect these causal interactions in the model world. So that's the rough case for premise 2. Now, of course, there's a number of immediate responses to the rough case, which involve finding actually structural differences between ordinary situations and even full-scale models or simulations of them. There's not, in fact, a perfect structural isomorphism between the two. There's all kinds of structural differences. Here are some. In the original world, we took certain things perhaps to be fundamental properties in those worlds. In a simulation, those will correspond to certain properties of the simulation, which maybe virtual properties or digital properties, which are far from fundamental. They're complicated properties on a computer which are realized and non-fundamental in the world of the simulation. So these virtual properties are less natural or less fundamental in these counterparts. It's a structural difference, because we took fundamentality and naturalness to be a structural property. Second, the laws are not ironclad. Presumably, someone can shut down the simulation. The evil demon can decide to stop the model. So these are strict laws, and maybe they were strict laws in the original situation. Third, inside the simulation, the causal connections, there may be causal connections that were unmediated in the original situation, which were mediated in the simulation. You've got some kind of CPU, for example, and maybe each of these interactions between data structures is mediated by the CPU. Fourth, the system will have extra fine-grained structure. When you run a simulation, it's got all this implementing structure on the computer, circuits, particles underneath those, a whole lot of causal structure that was not present in the original model. So the simulating system will have extra fine-grained structure. Fifth, the simulation is embedded in a broader world with a whole lot more structure. You might have thought this was, here's my reality, that's all of reality, but the simulation will certainly not be all of reality. It'll just be part of its reality. Sixth, in demon and dream scenarios, at least objects are mind dependent. And if you take mind here to be a structural notion, which you may or may not, at least that seems to be a potentially important difference. Six, this should be seven. Seven is all design. It could shut down. I guess that mirrors point two. Okay, so there's lots and lots of structural differences. To which I've got the same reply. I want to make the same reply to each, which is that none of the structural claims that are false. It's true, there are many structural claims true in the non-Cartesian scenarios that are false in the Cartesian scenarios. I want to make the case that none of those structural claims are required for the truth of ordinary physical beliefs, neither alone nor together. For each of them, it's very easy to think of them, of scenarios where they're false. This might lead to a few of our theoretical beliefs being undermined around the edges, but none of them tend to threaten the truth of our ordinary physical beliefs, like, you know, there's a chair over there, or here's an object of a certain mass, shape, and size. For example, it could turn out that ordinary physics is highly non-fundamental, and all the stuff that we think right now is fundamental is in fact 7 levels up in the hierarchy, or even as Jonathan has suggested, there's no fundamental level. If so, they'll be very interesting. A few beliefs about fundamentality, about what's fundamental, may have to be changed, but I take it none of that threatens the truth of ordinary claims about tables and chairs. It could turn out that the laws we think are ironclad are not ironclad at all. Maybe there's a God who's actually capable of suspending the laws, changing the laws at any given time. It's so interesting, but again, we're not inclined to say that threatens our ordinary beliefs. It could turn out that all is designed in the same way. Could even turn out that physics is realized by mind. Some people think this. People think about panpsychism in the philosophy of mind. Some entertain the idea that matter is realized by fundamental mental properties. It's certainly a speculative hypothesis that would revise some of our theoretical beliefs, but doesn't entail there are no tables and chairs. I think not. So all of these things could be, all of these, and the same goes for the others, and I would argue others you might mention, other structural differences you might mention. Each of these could be false. In an ordinary non-Cartesian scenario, and most of our ordinary physical beliefs would still be true. A few theoretical beliefs here and there might be false, but that doesn't undermine the argument or lead to global skepticism. None of these are the kinds of differences that lead to the massive undermining of most of our beliefs about the world. Okay, so far we've just dealt with these full-scale Cartesian scenarios. What about smaller scale Cartesian scenarios, each of which can do skeptical work? For these, I want the general strategy is to say that, yeah, these do undermine some of our beliefs, a few at a time, and thereby give rise to certain forms of local skepticism, but they mostly don't play the role of supporting global skepticism. So take a local simulation, or a local dream, and so on. Maybe it's like, we're just going to simulate Rotterdam. Maybe it's one room in Rotterdam. Maybe it just got going. A few minutes ago, and then there are a bunch of memories or something. And then, so I don't know. Maybe I just came into existence, or maybe it was one of you, and I just walked into the local Rotterdam situation a moment ago. Anyway, this would end up being structurally like something like a local physical scenario, like the scenario of the Truman Show, where they just bothered to simulate Truman and his environment, and people walk in and walk out. So Truman has massively false beliefs about all kinds of stuff, especially beyond the realm of the simulation. But still, his local physical beliefs are still straightforwardly true, I take it. When he says here's a chair and there's a table, he's right. I think if you think straight about local simulations and what's going on for someone who's been inhabiting kind of a local bubble simulation for some time, then the same will go for them. Their ordinary local beliefs will still be true, even though they're right about things further from home. I mean, actually, in the case of someone like me who visited, is just visiting Rotterdam for the first time and has a massive number of memories of things elsewhere in the world, there were some interesting questions about whether the relevant model is the one responsible for the memories, long-lasting a whole lot of those, or the perception, just started having those since last night. But in any case, I think that the general point that local simulations lead only to local skepticism then will avoid a threat of global skepticism. Recent simulations, very similar issues apply. Russell's creating the world 5 minutes ago. Again, we may be wrong about the past, but we're still right about the present. No global skepticism here. Macroscopic simulations. People simulate tables and chairs at the high level without all the underlying physics. I think that would structurally be like a macroscopic physical scenario, where we're wrong about physics, but we're still right about there being tables and chairs among us. Of course, there's always going to be complicated issues about how the results of experiments get to come out right in these scenarios. But even if people figure out some way to finagle that without the kind of physics that we normally think is going wrong, that's going to lead to worlds where our beliefs about physics are wrong, but not worlds where our beliefs about tables and chairs are wrong. To get all the way to a global scenario, I think you need some kind of random scenario. At least that's the best way I can see to get to the kind of scenario where all of our beliefs would turn out to be false. Sometimes I call this the chaos hypothesis. Our experiences just get produced at random. Maybe there's just a random experience generator, and by massive coincidence, it yields patterned experiences of the kind I actually have that suggest an external world of the standard kind. Well, that I think would count as one where almost all of our positive beliefs about the external world would come out false. So that's non-vertical. That kind of scenario, I'm inclined to say, is excluded by abduction. It's just extremely improbable. So here I want to bring in the structuralist response to skepticism, gets a little bit of help from abductivist responses. Not in the standard way of saying somehow the simulation hypothesis or the evil demon hypothesis is a less good explanation and therefore ruled out. I'm not sure that's true or a good inference, especially given the reasons for taking simulation hypotheses seriously. Here I just want to use abduction to rule out these extreme scenarios where all the regularity in my experience arises from chance. I think that's very improbable and can be excluded by abduction. Okay, so overall then, structuralism and abductivism yield a joint response to global skepticism. If a scenario is explanatory, if there's an explanation of the regularities in our experience, structuralism entails that it won't be a global skeptical scenario, as the explanation will vindicate some of the structure. Now that I haven't really worked through all the details of here, but the rough idea is for the global scenarios that seamlessly replicate all of our experience just as we thought of it, are basically structurally isomorphic, and some of these local and recent and macroscopic simulations that do it less seamlessly are still going to vindicate some of the relevant structure, so it won't be global skeptical hypotheses. If it's non-explanatory, on the other hand, then they're ruled out by abduction. Okay, so that's the main argument now. I'll go into a couple of relevant distinctions and some objections. How am I doing for time? Been going about. Okay. So there's an issue here between different forms of structuralism and thinking about the physical world. The rough idea of, say, taking a structuralist view of mass, you want to understand mass as something like being tied to the mass role in physics. Mass is somehow defined, it's conceptually tied to playing a certain physical role. But still there's different ways of making this connection. In the philosophy of mind, we've got a famous distinction between role functionalism and realizer functionalism. So, beliefs are what plays a belief role, and then Well, role functionalism says to have a belief is roughly to have something that plays the belief role, or have the belief role be played, whereas realizer functionalism says belief is that property that actually normally plays the belief role. Have a belief is to have property P, where P plays the belief role. And you get a similar distinction for thinking about structuralism. You take a role structuralist view, say, of mass, where to have mass would be to have the mass power, or to have a property, any property, that plays the mass role. On this view, mass would be a structural property. And this is a more straightforward form of ontological structural realism, because it identifies mass with a structural property. Mass will be present wherever this structure is present. In any world where something plays the mass role, there will be mass. Realizer structuralism, on the other hand, says that mass is whatever property actually or normally plays the mass role. Mass need not itself be a structural property, and mass need not be present wherever this structure is present. Maybe there are worlds, maybe property 1 plays a role in the actual world, in a different world, a distinct property plays that role. On realizer structuralism, in that other world, it may not be mass playing the role. Mass may not be present at all. It would be a little bit like H2O and XYZ. So this would be a view consistent with certain forms of epistemic structural realism, where mass has an underlying non-structural nature, instantiated in our world, but not necessarily instantiated everywhere. The structure is instantiated. So I think I don't need to decide which of these views is correct for the anti-skeptical argument to go through. All I basically need for the argument to go through is to say it's a priori in the actual world something has mass if and only if it plays the mass role or is tied to the mass role, which is true for both of them. That said, I do think realizer structuralism is more plausible for most physical concepts, at least in thinking through these simulation scenarios. After all, just say we're in a non-Cartesian scenario. We're not in a simulation, and hurricanes in our world are not constituted computationally. Now think about a simulation of our world, maybe in a distant part of our world or in another possible world. Is that simulation actually a hurricane? Well, a certain form of role structuralism is going to say, well, if all the roles are replicated in that simulation well enough, then yes, it'll be a hurricane, which to many people is a counterintuitive consequence. Virtual hurricanes are not real hurricanes. They're analogs or counterparts of hurricanes, but they're not real hurricanes, at least assuming that we're not actually in a simulation. If we are actually in a simulation, then hurricanes have been virtual hurricanes all along. But if we're not, and the most natural way to think about virtual hurricanes is they involve different realizers of the same role. Same structure, different realizers. If we're actually in a simulation, hurricane will pick up virtual objects. But if we're not, it'll pick out non-virtual objects. So that's the view, and I think the same is arguably true of things like mass. And so I'm thinking about, the Empire State Building has a certain mass. Does a simulation of it have that mass? No. On the face of it, even though it might have all the structure. Right, so it seems somehow mass is tied to realizing properties too. And there's a complicated issue as to whether there are further structural properties that realize higher level structural properties or really deeply underlying non-structural properties. But at least it's not a straightforward ontological structuralism at the level of the roles themselves. I think the situation here is analogous to water. Picking out H2O is what actually plays the water role on Twin Earth, where XYZ plays the water role. Typically we say XYZ is not water, but if we've actually grown up on Twin Earth, surrounded by XYZ, then water picks out XYZ. I think realizer structuralism is the more plausible way to go here in handling the intuitions that virtual hurricanes are not hurricanes and so on. Totally consistent with the argument. This does have externalist consequences, and this is the overlap between the structuralist considerations I like and the Putnam-style considerations that brains and vats have true beliefs because their terms refer to the things in their actual environment that play the relevant roles in causing their beliefs, and so on. On realizer structuralism, mass refers to a certain property, at least partly in virtue of it playing certain causal roles, and its connections to oneself may be part of those causal roles. But I really think what does the work in the argument here that I've given is the structuralism, not the externalism. The argument would go through equally well on an internalist role, structuralism, where water was tied to the water role by definition, in the way that some people thought pre-Putnam, or that mass was tied to the mass role by definition. The argument would go through just as well on this kind of internalist structuralism type of role structuralism. So I see it as the structuralism doing the work, but anyway, structuralism and externalism can be seen as coming together to make this kind of reply go through. Okay, finally, I'll go through some objections to structuralism, or at least objections to this argument that I think may turn on anti-structuralist intuition. I mean, many people have a strong intuition that Cartesian scenarios are skeptical scenarios. I think many of these come from anti-structuralist intuitions that somehow, we have a non-structural grip on aspects of reality, like say, space or solidity and so on. This is partly brought out by the fact that intuitively these Cartesian scenarios are skeptical scenarios. One place I've looked around in the literature for places where you can find this structuralist line against skepticism, and you can find things which are at least vaguely related to it in Carnap and Busma and Putnam. The one place I found that it was actually relatively close was a footnote in Larry Sklar on Saving the Noumena, where he talks about kind of an extreme structuralist view. He says, if you took that view, then even the evil demon scenario would be one where our beliefs come out true. And then he says, but that can't be right. That's ridiculous. So clearly, this extreme structuralism has to be false. And I think that reaction is a fairly common one. Well, certainly the reaction that something's got to go wrong here. Because just look at the evil demon. Look at the brain in the back. Obviously, they're getting something wrong. I think if you work through the intuitions, my view is actually the basic intuition here is one about space. But let's just take a couple of easier cases first. Maybe you think they're getting the colors of things wrong. A really strong anti-structuralist about color would say, if I'm in a Cartesian scenario, things aren't really colored as they seem to be. Nothing is really red or green out there. Maybe I think that you can be gripped on. That's not just coming from real anti-structuralism. It's coming from something like not a non-structural grasp of color as a primitive property. Look, I know what it is, something to be red or green and so on. That's for it to have a certain kind of nature. And in the Cartesian scenario, nothing really has that. But almost nobody these days is an anti-structuralist like that about color. Almost everyone thinks that what it is to be red or to be green and so on is to have a property that plays the red role or the green role, in particular in causing certain kinds of experiences. And in a Cartesian scenario, you will have properties that play those roles. So that doesn't really distinguish the Cartesian scenario and us. So I just use the color case as a warm-up to, I think, somewhat harder cases where I want to say similar things. For an intermediate case, let's take solidity. I think many people have the intuition that in a Cartesian scenario, things aren't really solid. It's like, it's too insubstantial, really, to be a world. Maybe that turns on the sense we've got some kind of non-structural grasp of solidity as a primitive quality. But I think a better view that we've all gotten used to by now is that solidity is a matter of what plays the solidity role in resisting penetration and various other roles. And again, there's no particular reason, if what I've said is right, that structural role can't be played. Unless there's some other aspect in the role is to do blah, 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 when blah, blah, blah can't be present. Okay, but then now let's hear about blah, blah, blah. I think the most fundamental thing that generates these anti-Cartesian intuitions is a kind of intuitive anti-structuralism about space. That if I'm in a Cartesian scenario, things just aren't really laid out in space as they seem to be. It seems to me there's a lectern in front of me, and chairs, and a table over there, and people out there, and things are arranged in space in certain relative spatial locations to each other. And to me, and the intuition is, if I'm in a Cartesian scenario, all that is just wrong. I'm totally misled, deluded about space. I certainly think that, if you could vindicate our spatial intuitions about the world, that would be enough to refute global skepticism. We've got objects in space where they seem to be. And I think what this kind of Cartesian intuition turns on something like the idea that we have a non-structural grasp of space, spatiality, extendedness, location, as a kind of primitive, at least is involving certain kinds of primitive relations. We know what distance is, we have a sense of relative size, angle, and these various spatial notions. And I think this kind of spatial conceptual primitivism about space is a very tempting view, but I think just as with color and solidity, I think it's the wrong view. The best view of the concept of space, at least as it has applications to our physical world, is the functional one too. Roughly, space is what plays the space role in governing motion, and then there's various aspects to the space role in governing motion, in governing interaction, in causing spatial experiences, and so on. I've argued for this in a bunch of other works, arguing for what I call spatiotemporal functionalism, where space is what plays the space role, time is what plays the time role. This is now a big literature in the philosophy of physics on space-time functionalism, thinking about relativistic space-time through the same lens. I'm inclined to think this is actually where most of the residual action is, and if somebody really wants to hold on to their Cartesian intuitions here, that these skeptical scenarios are non-vertical scenarios, the best place is to resist this kind of structuralist treatment of space. So there's a lot to be said about that. Nonetheless, I think there's a pretty good case for the structuralist view about space as well. This ties into what I think of as Edenic intuitions. I mean, there's a sense, I want to concede there's a sense in which, if we're in the evil demon scenario or the rain in a vat scenario, things are not exactly as they seem to be. Because I think there's a sense in which we seem to be in a world of primitive qualities laid out in primitive space. I once wrote an article called Perception and the Fall from Eden, where I said in the Garden of Eden, apples really were primitively red. They had that special primitive perfect redness, and this is a great room for the Garden of Eden. It's got all these wonderful, colorful chairs. Seems to be Edenic purpleness and Edenic yellowness. Well, actually, some of the colors are just a little bit off, I think, what it would have been in the Garden of Eden. But, maybe fresh Edenically red. And it seems to have these primitive qualities spread out over the surface, and it all seems to be laid out in a primitive space. We have these models of there being all these things, but I think in all these cases, the ordinary world of science has suggested that, in fact, the world isn't like that, most famously for color. Nothing actually has those primitive color properties. They just have complicated surface properties that play the color role. Nothing has Edenic solidity, and I would argue nothing actually has these Edenic spatial properties either. There's just complicated relativistic / quantum mechanical / string theoretic constituted properties that play the space role. So my view is that even in the, yes, it's true that if we're in the brain out of that scenario, things are not the Edenic way that they seem to be, primitive colors in primitive space. But it's equally true that in the ordinary world of science, things are not like that either. We've fallen from Eden in this world. And in fact, I think we basically more or less know that. So so then the Cartesian skeptical scenario is no worse off. The Cartesian scenario is no worse off than the non-Cartesian scenario as we think of it. We still get our premise if we're fine the non-Cartesian one, we're fine in the Cartesian one. Now you might go on to say, oh, well, this is even worse than skepticism. Now we actually know that in the ordinary world, most of our beliefs are false. But I think that's actually the wrong reaction to the ordinary world. The mere fact things are not exactly as they seem to be in the ordinary scientific world is not good reason to say most of our ordinary beliefs are false. We just hold our ordinary beliefs to a somewhat lower structuralist standard. Rather, we move from this primitivist conception of the world to a structuralist conception, and our ordinary beliefs about the world get to come out true that way. And that's the view I've tried to argue for in some other works. But in any case, the skeptical scenario, the the Cartesian scenarios at least come out no worse than an ordinary non-Cartesian scenario. There's worries about whether this involves some kind of descriptivism. I think, no, I'm not as opposed to descriptivism as some people, but in any case, I think you can make all this work without descriptivism, only using the much weaker relation that in constructing the world I call scrutability, and there's a little bit about that in this, in constructing the world. There's a question about whether, to what extent this structuralism is motivated by empirical considerations, and to what extent it's legitimate to appeal to empirical considerations in answering this a priori skeptic. It's like science that showed us that certain things about our concepts that show us that skepticism is false, and a really radical skeptic is not going to grant that premise. And it raises the worry that maybe there's going to be an evil demon. We're actually living in an Edenic world where there really are primitive colors and primitive space, but somehow an evil demon is within that Edenic world is trying to convince us that we live in a quantum mechanical and relativistic and string theoretic world where things aren't like that. There's an interesting question about how that impacts on the skepticism, but maybe I'll save that for the Q&A. To stay neutral, just to give a way of putting all this that actually stays neutral on the question of whether structuralism is true, you can also put the view as follows. Even if some sort of global skepticism is true for non-structural truth, this is, I guess, roughly what I think. Maybe we have certain non-structural concepts of the external world, concepts of intrinsic color and primitive space and so on. I actually think that even if we have those concepts, we have very little reason to believe that our beliefs about those are true. In that sense, I guess I'm an epistemic structural realist in that for the non-structural part, there's, if there can be these primitive concepts of primitive color and spatial properties, we've got no particular reason for thinking they're instantiated. I'm a skeptic, actually, about those. So even if some sort of global skepticism is true for non-structural truths about the external world, it's false for structural truths about the external world, restricting to a class of structural truths about the external world, those which I think are actually the content of most of our ordinary beliefs about the external world. Global skepticism is not true for those in any scenario that vindicates our experience. Enough of the structure will be vindicated too that global skepticism comes out false. There will be certain extreme scenarios where now that structure is present, like the random world, but those ones end up being ruled out by abduction. So staying neutral on structuralism, I guess then we get this more restrictive claim that global skepticism is at least false for a structural truth about the external world, with the addition of the premise about structuralism constituting the content about ordinary physical claims, then you get an argument against global skepticism. Thanks.
Okay, I'll give you now 2 minutes, and then you can formulate a good question, right? And then we move to the Q&A.
I'll make no promises for
You use method or unused? Unused is good.
Okay, ready for it? We've got to do this by the hand method. So everybody who wants to ask a question, raise your hand. I'm going to give you a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, we start with number 9.
Thanks for that, David. I think a corollary of your argument is that intelligent design is put to rest. The support of intelligent design has no reason to deny evolution. In fact, if they do that, they're blaspheming God's design.
Sorry, I'm slow today. Can you say a little bit more?
Isn't intelligent design a special case of a global, well, maybe not global, but recent skeptical scenario? World was created 5,000 and something years ago.
You don't mean intelligent design, you mean creationism?
Sorry, I mean creationism.
Okay, okay. I think of intelligent design as, but there is a whole lot of evolution, but maybe some nudges along the way by a designer. Okay, so it's interesting. If you're in a creationism is it's a close cousin of Russell's 5 minutes ago hypothesis. So we take the version of creationism where I guess there's going to be different versions of this. I mean, now we have all kinds of evidence about stuff that happened, much more than 5,000 years ago, not just the fossil record, but we're taking all that was built in by our designer. Then our designers were going to be using a massive model, presumably, to, wow, the fossil record just like that, the background radiation just like that. And so on. It's like, wow, God sure does begin to look like a very serious evil demon. Why on earth would we scientists be deceived in this way? There is an interesting question. I don't think anything I've said rules that out. I would just count that as a local skeptical scenario. There is an interesting question about what our words end up referring to in a situation like that. I mean, there's going to be this background model. It's basically a situation where our beliefs about the world are produced by two different structures. God's model, and then God's model for everything before 4004 BC, was it? And the ordinary physical world for everything since then. I guess I'm inclined to believe the ordinary world has been up and running for long enough, 6,000 years or so. That's going to serve as the dominant source for most of our beliefs about the world. So we're still going to have most of our ordinary beliefs about the world are going to be false. And when we say such and such happened 100,000 years ago, we'll be wrong. Now, there's an interesting, if you take the Russell hypothesis and say I've just been created right now based on God creating the universe with all my memories intact and the fossil record intact and so on, then at least at the very beginning, maybe then the meaning of all my words is going to be grounded in the model. And when I say all this stuff happened 100,000 years ago, maybe it'll actually be correct. That would be like being in, because I've just emerged from a simulation. So shortly after you emerge from the simulation, your words your beliefs get to be true of this simulation. You hang out long enough, then there's this discussion of slow switching. You go to twin Earth and you hang out there long enough, your twin water begins to refer to X, Y, Z. But anyway, you were saying that I would have some way to rule out, have some argument that ruled out this situation?
No, not the situation.
Yeah.
I thought that a creationist would then be wrong in denying ordinary scientific beliefs.
A creationist, so what's the kind of scientific belief you have in mind?
Evolution.
Oh, I see. So, okay, yeah, very good. So, we think, so scientist says these hundreds of millions of years of evolution happened. The creationist says, no, God created the world and evolution didn't happen. The fossils were just planted there. And then the structuralist says, well, God used an evolution model to get all that stuff there. And by your lights, all this really happened. I guess I would say that a structural equivalent of that, probably if God really worked hard, did a full-scale simulation, that a structural equivalent of that happened, but was there actual evolution of biological organisms? Here is the point where that semantic point now enters, I think. Probably for us, having been hanging around in this non-simulation world for long enough, my word, biological organism, is perhaps fixating on non-simulated things. So the things that evolved inside God's model weren't actual biological, what we call biological organisms, but virtual counterparts of those. On the other hand, if God created the world a second ago, and this is the first moment there's been non-simulated creatures, and all of my beliefs and your beliefs and so on actually came from God's model, then I think what you say is probably absolutely correct. Then if any creationist wants to say evolution never happened, I say, nope, it did happen. It happened virtually, which is what it is for it to happen in the world of our Genesis.
Okay, you go to the next number in line. Could you please say your name out loud, because the Q&A will be transcribed.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Tucker. Dave, I was wondering if you thought about how this applies to Boltzmann brain scenarios, where there's sort of random momentary fluctuations out of thermodynamic equilibrium that creates brains just pop in having our experiences and pop out. So I guess that's a random scenario.
Yeah.
And you say that that's excluded by abduction, but I'm worried that that's exactly the case for them. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, now Boltzmann brains are tricky here, and they're certainly the best case for something like the chaos hypothesis. I do think if we are Boltzmann brains, then I don't want to run this line on Boltzmann brains. I think Boltzmann brains are in fact massively diluted if they get to the point of having beliefs at all. I do want to argue that Boltzmann brains can be excluded just for very familiar reasons. They lead to all kinds of self-undermining beliefs. There's got to be something wrong with any scientific theory that makes it probable that we're Boltzmann brains. But do I have anything good and original to say about that? No, nothing especially good.
Okay, next one.
Stephen French. So I was wondering if you could help me get clear on your response to premise 2, because it's hot and I'm a bit tired and I didn't. So one of the things that one of the objections that structural realists face is that we don't accommodate causation, and so we're unable to distinguish between mathematical structure and physical structure. And the likes of Tegmark are like, yeah, there is no difference, who cares, it's all mathematics. But those of us who are not Tegmark feel an obligation to accommodate causation, and when we try to do that, it's typically rejected as introducing something non-structural. So someone like that, certain names in mind, would say, well, doesn't that give you make the Cartesian scenario non-veridical? It doesn't have causation that makes, as it were, the physical. And I wasn't quite clear in your responses. I mean, you talk about causation being mediated. I'm not quite clear how you, as a sort of structuralist, would respond to that.
Yeah, so you started with this sort of Tegmark worry about how the structuralist gets the world to be physical at all as opposed to merely mathematical, which I think of, and I guess there's how the world gets to be concrete at all as opposed to
it's just swapping one word for another.
And I certainly think that that's the sort of the most extreme version of a Newman-style worry is you've got the structuralist doesn't have enough constraint in their vocabulary even to make the world concrete, let alone to constrain the number of objects. And I guess I think you need some elements in your primitive vocabulary which are going to have concreteness as an implication. I think of it myself as being in the way that, for example, the existential quantifiers in physical theories have to be understood. When you say something exists, you're actually saying it exists concretely as opposed to mere abstract. Otherwise, if you just understand the quantifiers as being satisfiable by abstract objects, then of course they're trivially satisfiable by mathematical structures, and it becomes totally obscure have we ever got evidence for or against any physical theory. So I would be inclined to think that somehow in the way that the quantifiers are understood in scientific theories has to come with some kind of commitment to concreteness. But if you don't like that, of course, there are options. And the other, I mean, of the non-structural notions I had here, I had naturalness, where were they? Sorry, the structural notions beyond logic and math I had here. I had law, cause, fundamental, natural, part. I guess part applies to mathematics. You can make the case for, it's interesting whether naturalness has any commitment to concreteness. Let's say there are ways of understanding them, but you're absolutely right, though, the cause is one of the natural things to appeal to distinguish them. I mean, I don't want to get into an argument as to whether cause is a structural term or not. I just think you do need to appeal to something beyond pure structure to remove both the Tegmark-ish problem and the Newman problem, and it's a matter of adding relatively little. I'm happy to have causation as a basic primitive. And, I think it's structural enough for me, and likewise, laws of nature and knowing necessity, and I guess James is going to talk about natural necessity as a structural expression. Again, I think if you've got that, then probably that gets you beyond the mathematical realm. It's not clear that natural necessity is a notion that applies to the purely mathematical realm. But then this raises your worry about scenarios, which is about these Cartesian scenarios, which is they don't really have causation. I guess that's not the way I'm thinking of them. I think in all of these scenarios, they're all concrete, so they're not falling on the merely abstract side of the divide. They're concrete, but I think more than being concrete, there's genuine causation. Every simulation I've ever run, every computer program that's ever been run, there's genuine causation going on inside the computer. There are actual parts inside this computer. Here's my iPhone. I run a little simulation of I'm playing a video game involving knocking over a bunch of skyscrapers inside a city that's got a little physics engine, and there are data structures. There are circuits inside the iPhone. They're taking on certain voltages which are affecting other circuits via real causal connections. Some of it's mediated by a central processing unit, but yeah, there's actual physical causation. Well, at the very least, there's counterfactual connections between if this data structure takes on this value, then this data structure takes on this value, and whenever that happens, there's a physical effect of one thing on another thing. And my own view is that's what it is to implement a computation for a physical system, is to have causal structure that mirrors the formal structure.
So just to be clear, so what you mean by a Cartesian scenario is a concrete causal scenario, not, so there's a different kind of scenario which would be the Tegmarkian scenario. So everything you've said, I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's one of the objections to structuralism. Everything you've said then introduces causation and concreteness for what you think of as a Cartesian scenario. Doesn't for the Tegmarkian case, but there you're saying one can appeal to some kind of primitive, has to just appeal to some kind of primitive notion, whether it's naturalness, fundamentality. We'll be hearing about that from Kerry, and there's all problems with all primitives, of course. You have to pick one. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I've certainly been thinking of all of these Cartesian scenarios as concrete scenarios. So there's another interesting skeptical worry, which is how do we know we're not living in a merely abstract world? That's a fascinating question, which I haven't really thought about all that much, but it's certainly worth thinking about. I guess I'm inclined to think, I know by introspection, that I'm not in a merely abstract world. I know that I'm conscious, and that is concrete. So I think I sort of know, if not a priori, I know introspectively that I'm in a concrete world. So I'm inclined, and then could it be that everything outside me is abstract, but somehow, but then what's its relationship to me? And then I was like, well, it doesn't have to be like something like causation, and then I don't really understand how this merely abstract stuff could cause my concrete experiences. So I guess I think that scenario can be ruled out a priori. So that's why I'm not considering those scenarios. But there is the general worry for structural realism about how do you formulate the structural content of your theories, so it excludes merely abstract scenarios. And I guess I'm thinking that something in your primitive ideology has to be understood as sort of concretely committing. And yeah, I think causation is one promising source for such a bit of vocabulary. I guess I don't want to rest everything on causation. I think I can make sense of scenarios which don't involve causation. So I suspect that it may be that you have to understand some of the basic quantifiers as committing to the concrete, but I think there's different ways to go here.
Sure.
Okay, let's move to, is Kerry? Yeah?
I'm fine. I was the question.
Okay. And later on, Simon?
I think so. I'm not sure. So Simon Saunders. So well, I want your talk, and you're convincing me. But I've got a slight problem with what you really mean by structuralism, because normally structuralism in philosophy of science, anyway, is taken to mean that science should perhaps restrict what it claims about reality in certain ways to be spelled out. And although you often spoke about ordinary beliefs coming out of theory, I don't know how far down that's supposed to go. You also sometimes spoke about scientific stuff also being, as it were, in the simulation. So is there ever a point in which well, what I suspect is happening is you're taking a sort of a meta-theoretic perspective or something. It's at that point that you become a structuralist. But just at the object level of doing ordinary science, is any of it to be changed? Or would you call all of that structuralist?
Well, I restricted my claims to the physical world, and basically to claims. Maybe I didn't say this, but I think in the longer version, claims roughly in the vocabulary of physics, using notions like spatio-temporal notions and notions like mass. Although I do want to at least allow that ordinary claims, like there is an object of a certain shape and size and mass, fall into the scope of my claims. Just thinking if I can vindicate the truth of those in skeptical scenarios, that's enough to answer the global skeptic. That leaves open whether there are claims in other vocabulary that might still have to get a non-structural treatment. I haven't said too much about that. As a matter of fact, I think there is a massive part of our ordinary conception of the world which I think does not adequately get a structural treatment. That's the mental. I'm certainly not inclined to give a structuralist analysis of consciousness. And if someone wants to be an ontological structuralist about all of reality, I think the familiar arguments against physicalism and so on work even better against arguments against structuralism. Like Mary inside the black and white room can know all the structural claims about reality, but that won't tell her what it's like to see red, and so on. So at the very least, I'd want to carve off a massive exception for the conscious and for much of the mental. Is there more now? Are there other things in our ordinary discourse to worry about? Certainly there are elements of our ordinary discourse which are non-structural. I mentioned the Edenic properties, and maybe who knows this, any number of folk theories of the world that may have non-structural elements, but things that actually have applications to the world and get to be used to make true claims about the world. I guess I'm inclined to think the structural and the mental will give you most of it. In constructing the world, I argued that roughly, well, first I argued that a vocabulary, a physical and phenomenal vocabulary, you get plus a little bit of extra indexicals, and that's all will entail everything. And with a few stronger, and then I went on to argue that structural plus phenomenal description of the world plus the extra stuff will entail everything. So that's maybe to say the main exception on my view will be the mental.
Right, so talk about molecules, viruses, cells, even atoms, all of that stuff goes through, on your view, as being true in the phenomenal world, as it were, true in the simulation.
If we're in a simulation, if we're in a full-scale simulation, then our ordinary talk about viruses and so on I take to be true, and not just computer viruses.
Right.
If we're not, then talking about them counterfactually, well again, the issue I mentioned about hurricanes comes up here too. Maybe viruses are essentially biological, simulations are non-biological. Maybe it's going to be tied to certain realizers. So then I don't want to say that in a simulation there's literally viruses, but still there are virtual viruses, counterparts of viruses, things that play the virus role, such that if we are, as a matter of fact, if that is our scenario, then viruses are virtual. I would roughly say that the concept of a virus can probably be analyzed structurally as the thing that plays the virus role, and then maybe what it is to be a virus is going to be partly tied to certain realisms of the role.
I mean, I'm not going to push, but just to comment that it does seem that most of what you call structuralists could also be called functionalists.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I go back and forth between these terms. A little, I think of functionalism as the kind of structuralism that relies centrally on causation in the roles, and it's true that an awful lot of what I said here relies on causation. So I'm happy to go with functionalism about the physical. I think functionalism about the physical is very, very close to what's standardly called structuralism about the physical. So I want to use the standard vocabulary if you think there's an important difference.
I think there is, but never mind.
Maybe this does raise the issue that Stephen brought up, which is some people worry that causation is non-structural vocabulary. If you're the kind of person inclined to think causation is non-structural vocabulary, then by all means think of this as functional.
And the kind of person who thinks that the structuralist view of science somehow limits what we claim from what a scientific realist would say. So it's that limitation that I was trying to get at, which I don't think is really present in my book, which makes me think you're more of the functionalist than the structuralist.
You want to limit the domain of the structural realism?
To limit claims that are made about reality.
Yeah, so there may be many claims which are true about reality, but the scientific ones or the blah 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 ones that are structural, there may be some other ones which are not structural. We're not talking about that. Yeah.
Gijs.
Thank you. So I was wondering, my name is Gijs Leekhout. Is your argument also an argument to be not skeptical about what we beliefs we have during a dream? It can be a dream you had or a dream I had. A dream I really had about the beliefs I had in that dream about the external world I experienced in that dream. And if not, why not?
Yeah, no, dreams are interesting. I mean, I think there's a version of this that applies to dreams. You know, if you take a version of Descartes' dream scenario where everything, my whole life has been a dream. Everything I ever remember experiencing has all happened in one big long dream that I'm still in. If that's the case, then I think I basically want to say the same sort of thing that I said about evil demons and simulations and so on. That dream is going to involve a giant model with all this structure, and that's going to be enough to vindicate my claims. It is true it's going to be mind-dependent, and fairly strong form of mind-dependence, dependent on my own mind. Some people might worry that's enough to somehow render it dodgy or the claim is false. I don't. I think that it's a viable hypothesis that there are still tables and chairs that are somehow constituted by another part of my mind, and that's what I go with that's where I go with the eternal dream hypothesis. You're going with more like a temporary dream.
It's just a real dream I had.
I'm actually lying back in my I was lying back in my bed in New York. I had a dream about this Rotterdam conference, and a little short dream. And then we want to say that ordinary dreams are going to be vertical in this way. I'm inclined to say no. Why? Because I think we still use our ordinary concepts in our dreams, which are tied to our ordinary reality. This is kind of the way, it looks like it's more like the recent matrix hypothesis, right? Someone kidnaps me and someone puts a virtual reality device on me. I'm napping on my couch, and then somebody puts a Oculus Quest on me, and it's super good. It's got really good audio-visual stuff. And then I wake up and I don't realize I'm wearing the Oculus Quest. It's like, oh, here I am in Rotterdam, and I believe that I'm in Rotterdam. There's people around. Maybe there's a couch in the corner of the room. It's like, oh, damn, it's time for my talk. I might for a moment believe I'm in Rotterdam and all the people are there, but I'm actually back on my couch. So then, no, I don't want to say that belief is correct. Why? Because all my concepts are still anchored to my ordinary reality, where I acquired them. Now, if I stayed in that virtual reality for long enough, then maybe all bets could be off, like this slow switching situation where you go to Twin Earth. Or if the dream went on long enough, maybe it would have potential. There's also an interesting phenomenon of lucid dreams. I think with virtual reality, when you know you're in virtual reality, then you very quickly get to apply your terms to virtual. I think when you know you're using a VR device and you form beliefs about your virtual world, I think they're mostly true. Because I think we somehow adjust our concepts very quickly to be concepts of the virtual. I think for a lucid dreamer, something like that may apply as well. If you know you're in a dream, then all this is vertical. You have these kind of concepts which are deliberately applies to the dream, and I think many of your dream beliefs may then be true. But if you're in a situation of dreaming but not knowing you're dreaming and thinking you're in ordinary physical reality, I think, yeah, when most of us are in that situation, we actually have those beliefs are false.
But why doesn't your argument apply then? So where does it break down?
I think, well, the first argument was one about full-scale scenarios. This is not a full-scale Cartesian scenario. And then I went on to talk about structural differences. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that this dream scenario, like a very local dream scenario, just simulates a little room. Obviously, that's a massive structural difference. Most of the physical world is not going to be present there, so that's a big structural difference. And I would say that's a structural claim. Well, what I went on to say about recent simulations is that and local simulations, is that they are structurally like local physical scenarios. And that in local physical scenarios, some of our local beliefs are true. Oh yeah, but what is the extra thing? Okay, maybe I should be a bit more explicit about this. I think there's a relevant structural difference in dream scenarios and also in these things like these intelligent design scenarios, which is there are two sources of our beliefs about the world. Maybe there's an ordinary physical world in this case that produced many of my background beliefs and memories and so on, and there's a little dream model that's producing a bunch of local stuff. Or in Guido's case, maybe there was a artificial design, there was a designer that produced a bunch of stuff, and a bunch of my beliefs fit in that way, and there's some other stuff that's coming in this way. That's a relevant structural difference. There are these two sources. And what I want to say about those cases is, then in many of those cases, many of our beliefs come out false. Roughly ones corresponding to the dominant source may come out true. Ones corresponding to the non-dominant source come out false. And that's what I would say to the dream case. But I probably should have mentioned that under potential structural differences. I mentioned it instead under the heading of recent simulations. But you're right that it needs to be. But yeah, that needs to be cashed out under the question. Where does the argument break down? I think I would address that under the heading of possible structural differences. I would classify this as a structural difference that undermines some beliefs, say the ones that come from the non-dominant source, but doesn't undermine the ones that come from the dominant source.
Manali?
So my name is Manali Darachani. I have a worry about your argument for spatiotemporal structuralism or functionalism or against spatiotemporal primitivism. I wanted to see if you could convince me out of the worry. So the worry is basically this. Suppose that the actual world is a 3n dimensional physical space with psi stuff undulating in this 3n dimensional physical space. And suppose at some time in the history of the world, this psi stuff has some sort of structural or functional isomorphism to something like particles in an actual 3-dimensional space. Now, the worry comes in when I combine this sort of picture with something like the property dualist views about consciousness. It seems to me on this sort of view, now the psychophysical laws will need to somehow, instantiate conscious experiences that supervene on these spatiotemporal functional relationships that are isomorphic to 3-dimensional spatiotemporal functional relationships. And so our conscious experiences will in some sense be like delusions of the actual world. We would think that the actual world is 3-dimensional even though it actually is 3n dimensional. And this seems to me like a somewhat skeptical scenario by itself. But what do you?
Yeah, that's interesting. To me, it looks kind of analogous to the situation with colors. Colors seem to be these very simple properties of objects, but as a matter of fact, what constitutes them is some extremely complicated properties that play a relevant role in bringing about experience and in other respects. So I guess I'd want to say something analogous about this 3n dimensional world, and more generally about all kinds of scenarios where ordinary 3 and 4 dimensional space don't turn out to be fundamental. that there's going to be some complicated properties that play the space role, the time role, the space-time role. And that some of those properties are going to be identified as properties like distances and so on. So we say, then is our world three-dimensional? Well, the world is not fundamentally three-dimensional any more than it fundamentally has colors. And maybe in some sense we represent our world at the Edenic level. Our experience doesn't represent the world as fundamentally three-dimensional. I go back and forth on this. I said this once or twice. Our spatial experience represents the world as having this fundamental Euclidean space and a dimension of time. Other people said, no, my experience doesn't do that. It says there's the three-dimensional space, but it doesn't say it's fundamental. So it's hard to adjudicate that phenomenologically. But I agree there is certainly there's a level of spatial experience where you represent the world as three-dimensional. Maybe even as fundamentally three-dimensional, but that's all kind of at this Edenic level. And I want to say some of that Edenic primitive level of representation, that can turn out to be non-veridical. But what I always want to say is there's another level. What we say for colors, we don't say red doesn't exist because those primitive things don't exist. We don't say things aren't red. No, there's still something red because there's something that plays the red role. Likewise, we don't say there's no space because there's nothing that completely satisfies our ordinary conception of it. And we say there's still something that plays the space role. And even in these complicated worlds, complicated physics, where space-time isn't fundamental, we'll hopefully still find things in these complicated worlds that play the space-time role. There'll be something that plays the distance role, for example. And then I want to say, yeah, the world is still three-dimensional. I mean, I like to think that the spatial-temporal functionalist project can recover three- and four-dimensional space and time from this complicated basis, precisely in virtue of there being things that play the role. So what I want to say in the color case is our experience of color is not perfectly vertical. Things are not exactly as they seem, but our color experience is imperfectly vertical because there's something that plays the role. I guess I'd want to say the same thing about our experience of the world as three-dimensional, not perfectly vertical, but still imperfectly vertical.
Okay, we are approaching the end, but Niels?
Oh, sure. Niels from Miltenburg. I was wondering about your use of abduction to rule out random scenarios. So I was actually quite surprised that you used abduction, because I was thinking, well, if we are allowed to use abduction against the skeptic, why not do it right at the start? And say, well, the real world is a much better explanation than me being a brain environment, being tricked by a neuroscientist or something. So what's the difference? Why can you rule out abduction for the random scenario? Or can you use abduction in case of random scenarios, but not for more ordinary
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I've always been interested in that. I agree there's some temptation to the abductive move, even against the ordinary skeptical scenarios. But always, even just prima facie, it always seemed a little bit dodgy to me. It's like, okay, it's not a great explanation, but it's not a bad explanation. It's like, yeah, simulations and so on. Like, pretty good grip on that. Well, it's like that's certainly a way things could go. Maybe it's not the absolute best explanation. Maybe it gets a bit lower probability. But yeah, you can maybe. So maybe there's some kind of grip abduction you can get. I guess I'm inclined to think, especially in light of things like thinking about simulations, the way, say, Bostrom does. Once you start actually thinking about, we're going to be building more and more simulations. Simulations are very much within our grasp. Before long, we're going to be making people inhabiting pretty complicated simulated universes and so on. And whether you follow Bostrom all the way to saying, it's actually 99% likely that we're in a simulation. I'm inclined to think considerations like that. Actually, I'm running a book that touches on these issues. There's a chapter of this book where I use the Bostrom style simulation argument, not to argue that we definitely are, or we very likely are in a simulation, but just to argue that we cannot know that we're not in a simulation. I think a fairly weak version of the Bostrom reasoning can establish that we can't know we're not in a simulation. In particular, I think it undermines the abductive route. The abductive route is meant to, is it somehow, once it becomes a live hypothesis that we're in a simulation in the way that I think that thinking about simulations the Bostrom style way does, then it's very hard for me to see how abduction is going to rule it out, especially once you start thinking there's going to be trillions of simulations around, trillions of simulated universes, and only one level 0 universe, suddenly the numbers don't seem to add up in quite the right way for abduction to get a good grip. So I guess that's why I inclined to think abduction in the original case is at the very least dodgy. The reason I think it's a lot better in this case is it's only now being applied to a very limited kind of scenario, one which involves massive, massive coincidence. And that's precisely the kind of thing that we normally think abduction is at its best in rolling out scenarios that involve massive, massive coincidence. There is the Boltzmann brain worry that Jonathan raised, but I'm at least inclined to think there's, one's on much more solid footing applying abduction to that very limited kind of scenario.
Okay, last question, Geert?
Yeah, my name is Chris. So I hope this is going to make sense, but I was thinking of this kind of analogy in the whole other debate. So if you try to be compatibilist in the free will debate, it can become quite hard to kind of delineate what issue, for instance, goes in the right way to be free. So, then it has this example of school children being taught for all the rational reasons how to behave. I think in a certain way would qualify as well, but if we would substitute it by indoctrination, neuroscientists, then it becomes politically offensive to call those belief free anymore. And I was thinking if you couldn't pull some similar moves in this debate. So, at one point, I don't have the hand over me, so I don't remember quite well, but you acknowledge that there are in standard skeptical scenarios, even structural differences, right? You can, in a matrix scenario, all the right structures would be differently embedded in your system. So why couldn't you say that, just like in that free will debate, whether you're going to be realist about these macro level claims or ordinary claims, actually turns out to be can turn on something that is still structured because it's quite far in the background. And, if you would tell people the whole story with the embedding structure, they would find it officially offensive and say, well, this isn't what I meant. I don't know what theory eventually this is going all this is going to emerge out of, but that's not supposed to be like evil genius messing around with my work.
So you're making an empirical claim about what people will say if they discover that these scenarios are
as a way of teasing out their commitments, their intuitions about the realism.
I certainly got the certain very strong belief. If we discover that we are in one of these scenarios, we're not going to then deny that there are tables and chairs, except maybe in some very highly theoretical moments, some philosophers in the arguments. Just so we discover tomorrow that we're living in a simulation. Our simulators send us some signal on the sky. Hey, you're in a simulation. They hang the buildings up in the sky for a while and move the moon around, and enough to convince us, and then they put things back into place. Okay, we're going to freak out for a while. That's kind of weird, but then we're going to get back to our ordinary reality. And I suspect we're before long going to settle on a common understanding of it. Yes, there are. Yeah, all this is real. There are tables and chairs, and all this is computationally constituted. What's it?
I can also imagine people say, well, this is skepticism vindicated.
I think they'll say that the first day, and the second day, but before long, people are going to say the same things they say now. And there are people that say, in light of quantum mechanics, this is real. It's like, yeah, that view wasn't terribly popular, and you find some people that say that, but mostly people say no. All this stuff is real, despite it being constituted by quantum mechanics. And my solid empirical psychological prediction is that if something like this happens, then our reaction will take that form. I don't know how much should rest on psychology, but insofar as we've had all these various falls, like of colors, relativity, and colors aren't what we thought they were, based on what we thought it was. And we always end up saying, this thing exists, but its nature is different from what we thought, which kind of reveals, to me, suggests a very strong structuralism or functionalism in our reactions to the manifest image. What really matters is there being something that plays a role. I agree it's a big extension to to extend that to something like these simulation scenarios, might it's a much bigger fall from repeating. So at least I'm inclined to think, extending from our reactions to these first few scenarios, plus thinking through all this philosophy, I think that would be the right response to have the response that I mentioned. I guess my view is consistent with, as a matter of fact, most people will make a philosophical mistake and go on to say, I know all this is a skeptical scenario, but just as a matter of empirical psychological prediction, that's just what they want.
Okay, thank you, Gert. Well, let's thank the speaker for his talk and his answer. We reconvene in about 15 to 20 minutes.